Okay, welcome to week 4 of Mind Mend. This is the series on eradicating addiction. I'm Dr. O'Connor, your host and the creator of this content. So this week, we are going to start the process of taking a behavioral inventory, which is almost as much fun as it sounds. So before we dive into this beast, we're going to make sure that we have a firm foundation underneath us. Okay. So you want to make sure that you're able to hold your interval most of the time. Most of the time you should be able to hold this. Okay. Want to make sure that you're carving out time to sit either in the morning or at night, and that this is involving contemplation of what's happening for you before, during, and after use. Specifically, what are you trying to medicate? Okay, what's coming up for you physically, emotionally, mentally that you need to medicate? How effective is the addictive behavior in medicating this symptom or alleviating you from this symptom? And then how long are you getting relief for? Okay, so that needs to be in the contemplation component. Need to be doing your success inventory at night before bed. So how successful you were at achieving your goals for the day. Okay, and we need to be able to, at this point, identify a clear pattern of what's happening for you at these different phases of the addiction cycle. So you should be able to say with consistency, okay, before I use, these are the things that come up for me, physically, emotionally, mentally. And while I'm using, this is what's coming up, physically, emotionally, mentally. Same for after. So if you're not able to clearly identify trends here, it would be a good idea to pause, take a week, do some heavy journaling on this, and then come back to this week's content when there's a more thorough understanding of what that looks like. This is understanding your internal response or reaction at these different phases of the addiction cycle. And in order to break this cycle, it's really important that you have an understanding of this. So make sure that you have a pretty good understanding of what's happening for you during these different phases. So pending this foundation is relatively solid for you, go ahead and jump into this week's content. So what I mean by an inventory is we are going to look at our conditioned egos, our mental programs, and our learned habits and how they're manifesting in our current lives. So basically, we're going to bring awareness into these processes that have been largely subconscious, okay, including our reactions to things, what pushes us towards certain dysfunctional behaviors, etc. This can be a difficult thing for people to look at. If we're to the point that we have regularly dealt with wounding in a way that exhibits true addiction, typically we're behaving in ways that we aren't proud of. So as you step forward into this, be aware of that and be aware that a lot of times looking at this stuff will drudge up a lot of shame. It'll drudge up a lot of guilt. It'll dredge up a whole lot of things that you've been trying to cover up for a very long time. So try to be open with yourself throughout this process. Try to understand the importance of being extremely honest with yourself as you perform this inventory. And try to also early on bring in an element of self-forgiveness, because the truth is, by seeing these things as they are and by being willing to start the process of adopting different behaviors, you are 100% doing the unavoidable work that it takes to not do these things anymore. So you are using your personal power to correct these things that cause these feelings of shame, guilt, etc. So try to remember that as we step into this, and try to be strict and firm and also gentle with yourself at the same time. Okay, so we're not letting ourselves off the hook, but also we're understanding that in order to see and correct these things means that we have to really understand on every level the impact of these behaviors on ourselves and other people. Okay, this is the hard part. So know that going in. For symptom management this week, if you feel like you have all that you can handle by just holding the interval that you set for yourself in week 2, then just do that. Okay, you don't have to spread it out. You don't have to do anything with it. Just keep holding that interval. Okay. If you feel as though you could be challenged a little bit more, or maybe there's a particular day that you're feeling good, that you feel like you could challenge yourself a little bit more, go ahead and tack some extra time on there. Okay, go ahead and tack an extra 30 minutes, hour, 2 hours, whatever feels good for you on there. The more you can start stretching that out, the more clarity you're going to get. So if you do feel like that's something that would not push you over the limit in terms of capacity, then go ahead and stretch out the time a little. You can also tack an extra day onto your interval if your interval is longer, days, not hours, or you can engage in an activity that typically requires use without using. So all of those options are available for you, but at the base, just go ahead and hold the same interval that you set for yourself in week 2. The second thing we're going to do is we're going to increase the sit time from 5 to 10 minutes. If you're already sitting for 10 minutes, great. You don't need to do anything this week. You can increase your sit time to 15 if you'd like, but we want to make sure that you are consistently sitting for 10 minutes in the morning. Okay, so if you aren't sure if you've been sitting for 10 minutes, time yourself for a couple of mornings and see if you are consistently falling short or long of 10 minutes. And if it's short, set an alarm for yourself so that you can make sure you're actually sitting for that entire length of time. Okay, and then after we sit for the 10 minutes, we're going to continue engaging in contemplation. Okay, so what's going on for you before, during, after? What are you medicating? How effective is the addiction in medicating? And how long are you getting relief for? Okay, so we're going to continue contemplating those circumstances. At night, before you go to bed, we'll continue doing the success inventory. So how successful were you in meeting your goals? If you weren't, what can you do differently, or how can you set yourself up differently so that you can achieve these goals for the following day? Also, what I want you to add to this is I want you to be posing the question to yourself of, are there people, settings, emotions, situations that are regularly coming up that are pushing you towards use? I want you to pose that question to yourself and see what comes up as an answer. Okay, so every night before you go to bed, I would probably recommend doing this before you do the success inventory so that you can end your sitting period in the evening by thanking yourself and recommitting to the next day. So you can maybe open your evening session with that question of, what is it in my life that pushes me towards use? And it'll be interesting to see too if you identify this as something external or something internal. So meaning you identify the problem as being a person or a relationship or a setting, or if you identify it as something that you feel, right? Like grief or sadness or anger or something like that. We're going to make the connection between those two things, but just notice what comes up for you first in terms of the answer to that question. So add that to your evening regimen. I want you to add something to the positive change that you began implementing in the second week of this. So if you decided to go for a walk at lunch, maybe add 5 more minutes to that walk. If you decided to start doing yoga in the morning, maybe you can add an asana to that. Okay, or you can add a layer to something. So maybe you decided to read before bed and you're also going to not look at your phone for your hour before bed or something, or remove it to a completely different area. So whatever you choose, just add something to the positive habit that you've already started implementing. Okay, and we're going to keep that up throughout this week as well. I want you to periodically notice any changes in you from when you started doing this program to right now. Sometimes these are positive and you'll start seeing like, wow, when I started this, I was just a mess and I was, whatever the case may be. And now I'm starting to get some clarity. I'm starting to get some stability. It's easier to wake up in the morning. I feel more regimented. So that can be one way that it goes. The other way that it can go is as you start challenging these behaviors, your default mode network, the things that you are familiar with, you can hit a thick wall of resistance and your symptoms can actually get a little bit worse, which can be incredibly discouraging. Don't worry, it does happen that way sometimes. Just notice it and start to be able to recognize what it is, which is just your brain resisting change, which all brains do on some level. So notice any profound shifts in what's happening for you from when you started this to now, and keep checking in with yourself in that way as you move along in this program. It can be really easy to miss progress when you're deeply involved in the amount of emotional processing that we're doing here. So it's good to keep checking in to gauge how much progress you're making, what's shifting for you, and it can really help keep things in perspective that way. So continue to check in with yourself regarding your progress. Appreciate any moments of clarity or effortless sobriety. Okay, these moments will become more and more frequent. They'll get longer and longer. The more and more you're able to abstain, you'll get more and more of them. So as they start coming up, appreciate them, recognize and sit in them as long as you can. Okay, they're really nice when they start coming up. It gives you a lot of hope. It gives you a lot to look forward to. So really cherish those moments. After 3 to 5 days of thinking about what comes up as pushing you towards the addictive behavior, I want you to notice if there are things that regularly come up when you pose this question to yourself. Typically, it'll be the same few things to start, and then maybe some different things will drift in, but pay attention to the ones that come up with a lot of volume or with a lot of frequency, and I want you to start writing those down, okay? We're gonna use those in the wound healing component. So identify what comes up for you frequently in terms of pushing you towards addictive behavior. Write them down, okay? And it doesn't necessarily have to be the addictive behavior either, okay? If it's something that pushes you towards just dysfunctional behavior in general or resorting back to old habits or anything like that, write those things down. That's what we're looking for. We are going to specifically use that to get information into the target addiction, but any information on what things are pushing you towards dysfunction is helpful. So start writing all those things down. So that's really it for the symptom management for this week. So a lot of maintenance. We're adding a little bit more to our reflection periods. We're sitting a little bit longer, adding a little more to those contemplation times, adding a little bit extra to that positive habit that you're implementing. But for the most part, we're kind of in a holding pattern here. The big emphasis is going to be on the wound healing component for the next couple weeks here. So we'll get into that now. For the wounding, this is going to be a relatively extensive journaling exercise. So you probably are going to need a regular sized notebook. You are going to start by making 4 columns. Okay, column 1, 2, 3, 4. Number 1, I want you to label feels. Okay. Number 2, I want you to label causes. Okay. Number 3, I want you to label as reactions. And number 4, I want you to label as stepping stones. Okay. So we're going to start in column 2. And what we're writing down here are things that we attribute to being causes for being pushed towards addictions, maladaptive behaviors, or, really anything that cultivates shame or guilt that pushes us to behave in a way that we aren't proud of. This is what you're meditating on earlier in the week. Okay, so maybe don't start this exercise until you have spent some time posing the question to yourself of what things are pushing me towards this dysfunctional behavior. If you wrote those things down, this is what is going to go in the second column. Okay, and how I want you to try to do this is if there are, say, people or circumstances or stories or settings or whatever that make you angry, I want you to try to list those things together. Okay, so maybe working in the healthcare system makes you angry because you don't feel like you're seen or valued as an employee. You regularly get asked to extend beyond what you're able to give, whatever. If that regularly provokes this feeling of anger, you can write that down. Maybe your kids also make you angry. Maybe you have a friend that also makes you angry. Maybe your marriage. There's so many things that can make us irritable. So what I'm trying to get at here is try to organize the things that are triggers together in terms of what feelings they evoke. Okay? So if there's a lot of things that make you angry, write all those things down together. If there are things that make you feel sad, write all those things down together. Anxious, write all those things down together. You get what I'm saying? So write these things down in column 2, okay? Once you feel like you have emptied out or exhausted the things that cause these emotions in the second column, I want you to go back to the first column and write down next to these things or categories of things what exactly they are making you feel. So you're writing down your feels, okay? Maybe it's rage, maybe it's anger, maybe it's isolation, maybe it's depression, maybe it's guilt, maybe it's mania. It doesn't matter what it is. Write down next to these things what feelings they are evoking in you, okay? So that's step 2. In the third column, we are going to write down your typical reaction to these things. So maybe your typical reaction to feeling like you get walked all over at work is that you bottle it up. You bottle it up and you don't share it with anyone, and that ends up turning into something that you drink over later, okay? Maybe you end up yelling at your husband because of the way that he approaches you and the way that he makes you angry. And so that's your typical reaction to the internal feeling that his presence causes. So look at your second column, okay? Look at the feeling that it is provoking in you, and then write down what you typically do in response to that feeling. And I want you to do that for as many of these feelings as you can. And maybe there are ways that you deal with different feelings exactly the same. So maybe anytime you feel any number of these things in the first category, you drink over it. That's fine, but write it down in that third column, okay? So this can be the addictive symptom itself. This can be avoidant behavior. This can be aggressive behavior. This can be lying. This can be cheating. This can be stealing. This can be a lot of different dysfunctional patterns based on what you've taught yourself to do. So write it down, third column. How do you react to being in the column 1 space? Okay. Now, in the fourth column, for each dysfunctional pattern that you've listed in the third column, I want you to create 3 alternative options for yourself that you could do instead of what you're currently doing. So these don't necessarily have to be things that are perfect or that are in complete alignment with what you know is right away. As we discussed previously, a lot of times we need to make stepping stones for ourselves, because if we could just do something perfect that's different than the behavior that we're currently exhibiting, we would just do that, right? So make sure when you're listing these 3 things out that they are things you feel like you could actually do or move towards doing, okay? So for every dysfunctional behavior that you wrote down, or every dysfunctional response to what you wrote in column 1, 3 things that you could do differently that aren't what you wrote in column 3. So what you have just made for yourself in this exercise is a chart, okay? So you now have recognized what causes the emotional state that you would prefer to not be in, okay? So you have your causes in column 2, and then your emotional pattern that is not pleasant in column 1. You also have your projected reaction to being in column 1 right there in column 3, okay? The last thing that you have is a full column of alternative behaviors that you can draw on when you feel resourced enough to do this, so that you can start pruning out column 3 and moving towards column 4. So you've just created a map of yourself, basically. This is what causes these feelings. These are the feelings. This is what I do when I feel those feelings, and here are some things that I can do differently should I not choose to engage in the dysfunction in column 3. Okay, so you have this map for yourself. Now, what you can do before you take this out into the world and start practicing it is you can sit with this and you can use your own psychic ability to put yourself mentally in a situation where column 2 is happening. Okay, you can imagine it. Typically, it's things that come up often. Okay, so put yourself in the work setting or put yourself in the fight with your spouse or whatever. Put yourself in that column 2 place. See the emotion that it's going to bring up or feel it. We're getting into some somatic work here. This is good. So allow yourself to feel it. You can even notice what's coming up for you on these different levels. Physically, emotionally, is your heart rate going up? Do you feel flushed? Do you feel anger? What is it? Okay. So you go into that. Then you can imagine your programmed response. Okay, what you usually do, the column 3, the default. Now, leave that alone and imagine yourself doing one of the options that you've created in the 4th column instead. So before you take this out into the world, you can do this in the comfort of your own brain, in your own home, without involving anybody else. And what you're doing when you do this is you are starting the process of laying a different trail. And you're doing it without having to involve anyone else, which is usually a nice thing for you to do. So you can use your brain and this chart to start the process of a different mental programming system for yourself, development of different neural pathways. Okay, so you imagine the scenario, the column 2, you know what it's going to bring up for you in terms of the feeling in column 1. The better you get at identifying the physical symptoms that go with this, the easier it's going to get for you to identify this in the real world. Okay, so for instance, when I feel angry, I can feel my heart rate rising and I can feel my face getting hot. Okay, so if I feel that start to happen as I'm engaging with someone, that is a very early and definitive sign that I'm getting pissed off. Okay, and what that does in recognizing that physical symptom is it allows me to pull it back and go into those column 4 things before it escalates beyond my ability to do anything about it. Okay, so the more you can identify the physical components as you perform this mental exercise, the better. Put yourself there. Imagine what you're going to feel. Notice anything that comes up there. Now start imagining what happens if you take one of your stepping stones in column 4 instead of your knee-jerk or programmed reaction in column 3. Okay, you can start doing that. Now, once you've messed with that a little bit, you can go out into the world and inevitably you're going to be presented with opportunities to actually implement your stepping stones, right? So you're going to run into the dynamic at work or with your friend or your husband or whatever. So the next time it happens, you can watch this play out in real life instead of just internally, okay? So the trigger happens, whatever it is, you go into the emotion that your brain knows how to go into, okay? Then you can draw from column 4 instead of resorting to column 3 and watch what happens with your outcome, okay? You might get positive feedback or a positive response in how you've changed your behavior or in what taking the stepping stone instead of the predicted behavior causes in someone else, or you might get a negative response from them. You have to remember that no one likes change. And so when people get used to you showing up in a certain way, if you stop showing up that way and you start showing up in a way that exhibits healthy boundaries, that exhibits self-respect, that exhibits a lot of examination around your own process of things, this can be very threatening to people. So you may not be able to catapult yourself immediately into a positive reaction from people. This is particularly true with families and family dynamics. Okay, families expect a family member to show up consistently in the dysfunctional pattern. And when they stop doing that, it throws everybody off. Even if it's a positive change, it throws everybody off. So start taking this into the world and collect information on what your response is from other people or the setting or just in yourself. So be mindful of this. If this is something that doesn't involve other people, notice what happens for you internally when you implement something from column 4 versus column 3. Notice what happens in your nervous system. Notice what happens to you physically. Okay, so however your beginning stages look for actually implementing this, notice what happens internally, externally. This takes a while. Okay, there's a lot to observe with this. And there's a lot of different ways that you can implement column 4. If you are getting a response from column 4 that is largely negative from a very large, diverse group of people, an example of this would be, so historically I've struggled with male control energy, right? So I had a pre-programmed response to that to be kind of a bitch, okay, when I would interact with it. And obviously that's not very helpful. So as I had gone through my column 4 interventions in terms of how I could interact with that differently, I did find a couple that seemed to make my interaction with people who carry that kind of energy worse. So, you know, I tailor it, right, to something that not only feels good for me, but that doesn't push the person into going into more of the energy that I'm trying not to interact with, right? Basically not push the person's buttons. So you can experiment with this a little. And when you find some things in your column 4 that seem to be working well, stick with them. Also, if there are things in your column 4 that you know are going to be good for you, like exhibiting strong boundaries, you may, again, get some resistance from the rest of the world until it adjusts. This is normal. I wouldn't move your boundaries specifically because you're not getting a positive response from other people. I would hold it there for a while because, you know, that could just be their own resistance to change. So if it's something that you know is going to be good for you, for instance, saying to your job, I'm not going to stay 30 minutes late anymore, right? That may be an example of something that you get strong resistance from your boss, from your coworkers, whatever, but that you know you need to hold for yourself because you need to tend to your family and to your time that you take in the evening for yourself, etc. Okay, so you know you got to use your judgment around what things from the 4th column are going to need to be tailored and what things you just kind of have to hold firm in. You'll get a better feel for that. So I'll run through an example of one of the big ones through me. So there were a lot of instances early on in my recovery. I was in the middle of a devastating mental health crisis. I was getting sober at the same time. My brain was very much recovering from all of the ways that I had just bludgeoned it with antidepressants and substances, etc. So it was a very tender time for me. And so there were a lot of people, specifically the people that I had considered to be my close friends, that were causing a reaction in me of feeling isolated, of feeling depressed, of feeling worthless, even slipping into suicidal spaces with relative frequency. So the rejection would be how I would categorize that in a bigger way, of these people, of my friends, of my family, you know, people who are having a difficulty understand why I'm presenting this way, would put me into these places emotionally, okay? Feeling alone, feeling hopeless, etc., etc. Okay, so my column 3 for this particular cluster of emotions would be to smoke weed, would be to smoke cigarettes, would be to sleep, would be to isolate, okay, would be to periodically lash out in anger at the people who I felt like were rejecting me. Okay, so this was my column 3. What I put down in my column 4, and this was tricky because at this point I didn't know how to socialize with people, and I didn't know how to build friendships that were healthy, that were going to last, that weren't based off getting drunk. I didn't know how to do a lot of this stuff. So, you know, it wasn't like I could put in column 4, like, just make new friends, because that really wasn't on the table during this time. What was on the table during this time was developing a yoga practice, engaging in music therapy, and engaging in writing. So those were the 3 things that I would do instead of smoking weed, smoking cigarettes, burying myself in isolation, putting myself to bed at 7:30 at night, all of these things that kind of get you more and more stuck. Instead, I started drawing on these other 3 things that I had grown to find joy in on some level. Okay. There was quite a period of time where there was some overlap of these 2. It's like, well, I'll smoke weed and make music, or I'll, but the point being, eventually the 3rd column phased out and the 4th column prevailed, right? Which then promotes happiness and health and joy, which then makes things like friendship and a healthy social life and positive interactions with other humans accessible. Okay, so that's what I mean by a stepping stone, because what we need in an instance like that, right, are meaningful relationships, are close connections to friends and family, are, deep and meaningful conversations with people. But none of those things were accessible in that moment. So we used these other 3 things, right, the yoga, the music, the writing, to promote a sense of safety and well-being that then lays the soil, the foundation for the relationships to come in and start growing as the person heals. So that, in a nutshell, is the purpose of what we're doing here. So you can start out again by imagining this in your head. Then I want you to start acting it out. I want you to start acting it out when the triggers hit and when you're in the emotions, and start the process of pulling from the column 4 instead of relying on column 3. Okay, this is not easy, but the more you do it, the easier it gets. Okay, and the more you're able to draw on column 4, the faster you get out of column 3. Okay, yeah, it's really rewarding, really hard, really rewarding. Some pitfalls that you do not want to spend too much time wallowing in. Blaming and shaming other people. Okay, a classic example of this, guilty, blaming your parents for your trials and tribulations that you are now having to unfuddle yourself from. So while there are truths in that the way that our parents programmed us, or rather imposed their programming onto us, has consequences for us, blaming your parents is the biggest waste of your time and their time and everybody else's time that you could engage in. And the reason why is this: if you really want to go down that rabbit hole, okay, you can blame your parents. And trust me, I saw this a lot working in addiction medicine. There are a lot of examples of heinous parenting. However, you look at this, right, and you say, well, my parents were da-da-da-da, you start blaming them. Well, where did they get it from? Okay, were their parents perfect? Or did they just get the bucket of shit that their parents had imposed onto them, and then they gave you whatever they weren't able to fix on their own, right? So this stuff trickles down into the generations to come. So whatever our parents are unable to fix in themselves, they give to us. We give it to our children, right? So it's this painfully slow process of evolution and healing that happens, typically takes generations to fix things like alcoholism, like sexual abuse, okay, like physical abuse, like narcissism. It takes a long time to iron these things out, typically. However, you can drastically increase the speed of this if you're willing to see how this plays out in you and make very aggressive, intentional moves away from the dysfunctional behavior, okay? So again, an example of this would be alcoholism is a very common one. This was one that plagued my mother's side of the family, myself included, okay? There's a lot that comes with that. I'm not going to get into the details of that, but you can see it, right, over the course of the last 4 or 5 generations really play out. And it has gotten substantially better in both my mother's generation and then for my sister and I. However, there was a time when it was really easy to fall into blame for not just the alcoholism that was handed to me, but then all of the things that come with that, right? The things you have to undo that come with that. Very counterproductive if you're sitting in blame. Not counterproductive if you are using that information to better understand yourself. So through the lens of it's my maternal line is the reason I'm fucked up and I'm going to be angry at my mother forever. That's not going to go anywhere, but using that information to say, okay, I have a propensity to use alcohol to escape whatever I'm trying to not feel. Okay. I then engage in things like lying and manipulating and covering up. I then become irresponsible financially. I then become unwilling to form close and intimate relationships with people. These are all things that, yes, come from the maternal line, my maternal line specifically. However, I'm not using those things to be mad at my mother. I'm using that understanding of that generational trauma and sickness that exists in that line to see where it exists in me so that I can fix it. Okay? Because if I'm sober, if I'm not using alcohol and I don't lie to people and I create deep and meaningful relationships with other people, okay, and I'm not the kind of person that is going to make excuses for myself, there's no way that the stuff from that line can come in because I know that I'm not engaging in those behaviors, right? So, but if I can't see that, if I'm justifying things like my drinking, like, well, I only drink on the weekends, or I only do this, or I only do that, or I'm justifying the ways that I'm manipulating people or lying to them, or my inability to be responsible financially or whatever, I can't do anything about that diseased line if I'm living in excuses, okay? So it's really important here to discern the difference between blaming parent figures, blaming society, blaming all these external things as reasons for being the way that you are, versus using them to understand yourself. Okay, one involves stuckness and anger and resentment. The other involves wisdom and healing and self-understanding. Okay, so it's really important that you don't get stuck in the blame thing as you're using this information to better understand yourself. Okay, so that's a pitfall that can be avoided. Now, there's nothing that can get in your way as you move along on this path, meaning there's nothing that can stop you besides you. Okay, so if you have self-limiting beliefs, or if someone from the outside comes in and says, oh, well, you know, you've been trying to get sober for 10 years, there's no way you're going to do it, or there's no way that you're going to be able to make that career shift, or there's no way, you know, whatever it is, that can only affect you if you believe it. Okay, and you really only believe it if there's some element of truth in it. So a way to refrain from slipping into negative beliefs about yourself, about your prognosis, about your ability to get better, is to, if you get confronted either with a thought process from your own brain or someone else's negativity or whatever that places doubt on what you are trying to do in any area of your life, you can immediately reject it. You can just say that doesn't belong here. And if it keeps coming up, it's best if you can look at why you would believe that that's true about yourself. Okay. So an example of this for me would be as I started to connect with music more and started to feel more comfortable putting my work out there, there was this very long, uncomfortable period of time where I was sure that everyone thought that my work was shit. And while I'm sure some people thought it was shit, I'm also sure that some people could probably appreciate the progression of it, you know, and the way that I was using it too. So there was this self-consciousness every time I would get certain flavors of feedback from people or certain gestures from people in regards to my music and my work in that way, it would hit this nerve of like, you're not good enough. You'll never be a musician who's able to make a career out of this. You'll never amount to anything with this. Your work sucks. You should keep hiding it. Like all of these things would come up. And so it challenged me to look at it and say, why do you believe this about yourself? And there were multiple answers to that question, right? One was comparing myself to other people, because of course there are a lot of musicians out there who are extremely talented and doing a really good job at their craft. And so I'm comparing myself to these people and I'm like, I suck compared to them. So there was that. There was also this childhood thing that developed, you know, when I was very young in regards to performing in front of people and screwing up when I was a kid. And so there was that whole wound. there's just a general self-consciousness when it comes to being seen by other people. So there were a lot of answers to this, but where I ended up resting with it was, there are going to be some people that think that your work is shit. And there are going to be some people that can see and appreciate the beauty and depth in what you're doing here. And you're going to have to be confident and firm and excited about what you're doing, regardless of what either of these two groups of people think about what you're doing. And that felt like the most centered, peaceful place to rest this. So if people, your own narrative, your own default mode network start challenging you and start presenting these self-deprecating thoughts, situations, etc., try to see where in yourself you think that there's truth in those things, and then behave in a way that directly counteracts that so that you can know that it's not true, right? Because, for instance, if somebody now at this point says to me, like, something in regards to me being a drunk or an addict, like, I would literally laugh at them and just be like, that could not be further from the truth. I, have done a lot of work in that arena, and it's just not part of my life anymore. So as you get into that space with these things where you know that it's not true, they will not, these self-deprecating things from other people, from yourself, whatever, they're not going to be able to penetrate, okay? Because you'll know so firmly that they aren't true that they won't be able to affect you. But to get to this point requires you to reject these negative belief systems and to come back into yourself, which is, I can do this. I am doing this. I will never stop trying to do this. And I know I'm going to get the outcome that I want, which is true. However, you absolutely have to believe these things. And for a lot of us, when we come from these sort of lower places, it takes a lot of work to really believe that a lot of the time. So keep doing it. It gets easier and easier. Don't fall into the pitfall of believing your own negative brain or other people's negative narratives when it comes to your process. Okay. So the last pitfall I want to talk about is slipping into guilt or shame. Okay. So as we look at our third column that we've made for ourselves in this map here, that oftentimes will bring up quite a lot of shame or anger at yourself, or a strong desire to escape or get away from yourself. And this is all very common. However, it's not productive to go into these feelings, okay? You can see them come up. They're going to come up, and they're probably going to come up with regularity in the beginning parts of this. However, you do not have to get stuck in them, okay? Because what happens if you get stuck in them, if you look at your column 3 stuff, okay, and you see an aspect of your behavior that you're ashamed of. For me, it was sleeping all the time. It was like, God, you're just sleeping like 14 hours a night, like you're lazy, like that was the narrative that would come up around it. So if you fall into anger at yourself or self-guilt surrounding things like this, it's going to deplete you even further, and it's going to make these stepping stones in column 4 less accessible, and it's actually going to make the default stuff in column 3 more accessible. So you are directly working against yourself if you allow yourself to spin in shame, guilt, remorse, self-hate, all of these things. Okay, so again, these are things that are going to come up. The earlier you can identify them and move away from them, and what I mean by move away from them is say something to yourself along the lines of, you know what? I am doing the hard work of seeing this behavior and creating and taking clear and palpable steps away from this dysfunction. And all you have to do is look at your 4th column to know that this is true, right? So the guilt, the shame starts to come up. You look at your column 4 and you say, I am willing to see my behavior for what it is, take different steps towards a different behavior. And feeling guilty about the way I have conducted myself up to this point is not going to do me any good, because that is the truth. And the more that you are able to rely on column 4 or utilize column 4, the more that you're going to really understand this internally. And you're not going to feel the need to feel guilty or whatever anymore, because if you slip up every now and then and resort to column 3, which believe me, you will do, you will become more and more aware of what it feels like to slip up and be in column 3, right? Because if you're living most of your life with these stepping stones now in column 4, when you accidentally resort back to the column 3, it's going to feel awful. And you're going to be able to look at that and be like, wow, I used to do that all the time. And I used to sit in that all the time. And that feels terrible. So now I'm going to keep drawing on this 4th column of stepping stones instead of doing that, because that feels awful. And utilizing my stepping stones in column 4 actually feels like I'm living in integrity and creating a life that I want to participate in, and all of these things. So engaging in column 4 more and more, and less engaging in column 3 is what's going to keep you out of that shame and guilt as you really see and understand what's happened for you in column 3. Okay. Either one is self-perpetuating. So if you're staying in that shame, you're staying in that guilt, you're setting yourself up to be stuck in that 3rd column. You counteract that with self-validation, with looking at what you have done to do something differently in your 4th column. And then by actually doing it, that's the most powerful thing you can do, is actually implement this in the world, right? You're going to spend little to no time in the shame and guilt as you start to conduct yourself in ways that are worthy of praise, of validation. Okay. So don't get stuck in blame or shame of other people. Okay. For your circumstance. Don't do that. You can always change your relationship to external circumstances that you can't change, right? Because we can't change other people. We can't always change our setting, where we live, etc. We can't always change the dynamics of our family life right away. So if there are things that come up like this and you say to yourself, like, there's just no way I can change this, well, it's probably true. You can't change it on an outside. But what you can do is you can change your internal relationship to the thing. Okay. So an example of this maybe is when I graduated from college the first time, I spent probably $5,000 applying to medical school, and a lot of time, and didn't get in, and was absolutely devastated and was angry, ended up blaming all of the outside circumstances, the fact that I wasn't a man, my professors, for the fact that I didn't get in. I was absolutely distraught. I was like, what am I going to do with my future? So I couldn't do anything about the fact that I didn't get in. So once I really saw that, it was like, all right, well, you got options. You can either keep trying and you don't know if you're going to get in. You can take a different path. You can go to nursing school. And if you really want to go all the way, you can get a terminal degree. That is what I ended up doing. Or you can scrap this whole thing of medicine altogether, probably what I should have done. So I chose to pursue a different path instead of beating my head against a wall with the path that I thought was right. So we can apply this to, say, like, other people's behaviors. Like, if he would just do this, if he would just do this, if he would just do this, or if my kids would just do this, maybe instead stopping and being like, how can I show up differently that's going to preserve my internal feeling of peace and sanity and well-being? Okay. So instead of asking the question of what needs to change out here with these things that you're never going to change, other people, whether or not you get into grad school, outside circumstances, whatever, ask yourself, of what do I need to do differently to have a different relationship with this goal or this person? Maybe you need to set different boundaries. Maybe you need to react differently when they come at you with some, repetitive, consistent stuff or whatever. You can always change that. So there's never an excuse to not take responsibility for your behavior, the way that you feel about something, and your approach specifically to things that you can't change that are external. You can always change those things. Okay. So that being said, no more blaming outside people, circumstances, etc. Do not let defeating thoughts, people, circumstance into your brain. Do not let them in. And if they start penetrating, kick them out immediately. Okay. Use the evidence that you've created in your 4th column and whatever else you need to escort them out of your either physical or mental energetic circle as quickly as possible. Okay, so we're not going to let these things sink us. If you start feeling things like shame or guilt around the way that you've conducted yourself, try to, again, reorient by understanding that you are doing the work and creating the stepping stones to do something different, and that wallowing in the way that you've held yourself in the past literally does nothing but keep you stuck in the exact same behavior. Okay, so these are pitfalls to avoid, not just for this week, but for the next few weeks, big time, as we go deeper and deeper into this inventory. Okay, try to be extra gentle with yourself, especially as you're doing the Calm 3 stuff and really understanding the ways that your behavior has been dysfunctional. Okay, take good care of yourself, try to get good rest, try to implement a relatively healthy diet and move your body as you do this. All of these things will help you be able to do this inner work as quickly and effectively as possible. Okay, so if this feels like content that you need a bigger chunk of time for, as always, take it. And if not, we will see you in a week. Thanks for listening.